Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we are going to be exploring Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Now, listeners sent in excerpts, and we'll be using those to kind of dive deep into it. It's all about leading better lives, supposedly, but, well, it doesn't exactly take the typical approach. What are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, it's definitely not your typical self-help book. It's kind of a unique approach. Manson seems to encourage us to kind of embrace our imperfections and find the meaning in our struggles, which is interesting.
Yeah, like the whole choosing your struggles idea, that really caught my eye. And I mean, come on, a character called Disappointment Pander. How can you not want to read this book?
Right.
But before we jump ahead, let's rewind a little. One of the book's big ideas seems to be the power of not trying, or at least not trying in the way we're always told to. So what's Manson getting at here?
Well, he uses Charles Bukowski, the writer, as an example. He wasn't exactly known for being, all polished or conventionally successful. He was more raw and unfiltered, you could say.
He definitely didn't shy away from his flaws, that's for sure. Maybe that's what made him so relatable to readers. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just by accepting his imperfections and writing honestly about them, he achieved this really authentic voice. It resonated with people. He wasn't trying to be someone he wasn't, which is, pretty refreshing these days when there's so much pressure to project this perfect image.
It's true. It's like we're constantly bombarded with messages about being happier, richer, more productive. And it's like, whoa, it gets a little overwhelming. And then, when we inevitably fall short, it just makes us feel worse.
Yeah, that's what Manson calls the feedback loop from hell. You feel bad about not measuring up, which makes you feel even worse. And on it goes. It's a cycle of negativity.
So then not giving a fuck, the way Manson puts it, is about breaking free from all that.
Exactly. It's about accepting that life is inherently flawed and kind of finding freedom in that. It's about choosing what truly matters, and letting go of the rest.
Okay, so it's not about being apathetic or indifferent, but more about choosing your battles wisely. But what does that actually look like in real life? How do you decide what to care about and what to just let go?
Well, Manson dives into what he calls the subtleties of not giving a fuck. He says it's not about being emotionless. There are three key things he highlights. Being comfortable with being different, recognizing that everyone struggles with something, and then figuring out which struggles you actually enjoy.
Okay, so it's about reframing how we see challenges. Instead of trying to avoid struggle, it's about embracing the challenges that actually fit with your values.
Exactly. He even uses this funny story, this anecdote about a woman throwing a tantrum over a 30-cent coupon. It's a good illustration of misplaced priorities. It's a good reminder to kind of check in with yourself, see where your energy's going, and ask yourself, am I really invested in what matters most?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But honestly, that sounds like it'd take a lot of self-awareness. How do you get better at spotting those misplaced fucks, as he calls them, and then redirecting your energy to stuff that's, more meaningful?
Right. Manson says that choosing what to give a fuck about, it's an ongoing process. He calls it a subtle art that you have to practice. And he suggests, examining our values. What are we basing our priorities on?
Yeah, values, for sure. That's a recurring theme in the excerpts. He mentions his relationship with his brother was strained, and that forced him to think about his values. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So Manson, he valued having a good relationship with his brother. But the thing is, he realized he was measuring the success of that relationship in ways that were, kind of flawed. Like how often they talked, for example. And this misalignment was causing him a lot of unnecessary stress.
So he was focused on the wrong indicators of a good relationship, essentially. So it's not just about figuring out your values, but also how you define what success means in those areas of your life.
Yeah, that's the point. Manson says we need to always be questioning our values, making sure they're actually our own and that they're leading us toward a good life.
It's a powerful idea, for sure. Any other examples of the book about choosing the right values, so to speak?
Well, he contrasts the experiences of two musicians, both of whom were kicked out of really successful bands. Dave Mustaine from Megadeth and Pete Best, the original drummer for the Beatles.
Whoa, yeah, talk about a career setback. I mean, to get kicked out of a band like the Beatles. It's interesting how they both reacted so differently to it, though. What made the difference?
Their values. Mustaine, even though he had success with Megadeth, he was fixated on being better than Metallica, his old band. His whole value system was built around external validation and comparison, and that just left him constantly dissatisfied.
It sounds like he was chasing a definition of success that couldn't actually make him happy. What about Pete Best? How did his values play into his experience?
Well, Best actually found happiness outside of fame and fortune. After being fired from the Beatles, he made family his priority. He found fulfillment in his relationships, not in external achievements.
Okay, so it's not just about achieving success, but about what success really means to you personally. It sounds like Manson's encouraging us to go beyond the surface and really focus on values that resonate on a deeper level.
You got it. It's about aligning your actions with your values, even when those values maybe don't lead you down the most conventional path.
This is already giving me a lot to think about. It's like he's challenging us to take a long, hard look in the mirror and think about success and happiness differently. But what about all the external crap we face? How does this whole not giving a fuck idea work when, life throws you curveballs?
Well, that's where taking responsibility comes in. Manson says we often confuse responsibility with fault, which leads to, feeling helpless.
Can you unpack that a little? What does it mean to take responsibility without being at fault?
He talks about William James, the father of American psychology. James did this year-long experiment where he took 100% responsibility for everything in his life. And it helped him overcome depression and feel more in control.
Wow, that's quite an experiment. So it's about you have to focus on what you can control instead of dwelling on stuff outside your influence.
Exactly. The point is, even if you're not at fault for a situation, you're always responsible for how you choose to respond.
Okay, so that's a powerful distinction. It's like we have more power than we think to shape our experiences, even when stuff happens that's totally out of our control.
You got it. And taking responsibility isn't about blaming yourself. It's about having the power to choose how you react and move forward.
Yeah, that resonates with me. There have been times when I've gotten stuck in blame and resentment, like focusing on what other people did to me, but shifting the focus to my own choices. That feels a lot more empowering.
That's the key. It's realizing you always have a choice in how you interpret and react to things.
Okay, so we've covered choosing your struggles, taking responsibility. Does Manson get into setting boundaries, like saying no to stuff?
Oh, he does. And it's kind of an unconventional take. He talks about his experience traveling the world. He thought that experiencing a lot was the key to fulfillment. But then he realized all that chasing around was actually stopping him from committing to anything meaningful.
So it's not about closing yourself off to new experiences, but more about being mindful about how you spend your time and energy, like choosing depth over just checking things off a list.
Yeah, that's it. He brings up Russian culture where honest and direct communication, even if it seems blunt, is valued. It's about being authentic and building trust. He suggests that that kind of directness helps set clear boundaries.
That's an interesting comparison. It makes me wonder, do we avoid setting good boundaries because we're so focused on being polite and then end up with misunderstandings and resentment?
Right. That's a good point. Manson seems to think we should communicate more honestly and directly, putting clarity and authenticity ahead of just being nice. He even critiques romantic love, saying that the whole finding the one thing can lead to entitlement in relationships.
Hold on, is he saying we should just give up on love?
Not at all. It's about having realistic expectations and understanding that healthy love needs boundaries. You have to be willing to take responsibility for your own emotional well-being. And, sometimes you have to say no. That's how you maintain those boundaries.
So it's not about finding someone to complete you, but choosing to be with someone while staying true to yourself.
Exactly. We are each responsible for our own happiness. Healthy relationships give both people space to grow.
This is a lot to think about, especially for my own relationships. It sounds like this whole not giving a fuck thing is about being self-aware, making intentional choices, and, being okay with the realities of life.
Yeah, that's a great summary of what we've discussed so far. But there's one more important element we haven't mentioned. The fact that we're all going to fail. And how important it is to see failure as a part of growth.
Oh, interesting. Tell me what Manson has to say about failing.
For starters, he says it's not something to avoid, but something to embrace. And he tells this great story about Pablo Picasso. There's this woman who wanted to buy a drawing he did on a napkin.
I'm listening. What's the Picasso story?
So Picasso just scribbles something on this napkin. And the woman says she wants to buy it. He tells her, okay, it'll be $20,000. Well, she's shocked. She's like, it only took you a few minutes to draw that.
Yeah, I'd be surprised too. What did Picasso say?
He just replies, no, ma'am, it took me over 60 years to draw this.
Wow. That is such a powerful statement. He's acknowledging that his talent didn't just appear overnight. It took decades of practice, experimentation, and, failure.
Exactly. That's the whole idea. True mastery comes from making tons of mistakes. It's about putting in the work, learning from your mess-ups, and always refining your skills.
It makes me think about how focused we are on achieving specific goals. Like we forget to enjoy the process. We're so fixated on the destination that we miss the journey.
That's so true. And it relates to what Manson calls goal-oriented values versus process-oriented values. He says goals can leave you feeling empty once you achieve them. They're fleeting. but a process-oriented approach that keeps you engaged and growing.
So it's not about crossing the finish line, but about enjoying the journey, embracing the stumbles and setbacks.
Yep, finding joy in the doing, not just the achieving. Which brings us to one of Manson's most practical tips, the do something principle.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is this do something principle all about?
Basically, it's the idea that taking action often comes before feeling motivated. We usually wait to feel inspired before we start something. But Manson says, flip that. If you're not motivated, just do something. Anything, really. And then you use the reaction from that action to get yourself motivated.
So break the cycle of putting things off by just taking a first step, even if you don't feel like it.
Exactly. It's about overcoming that feeling of being stuck and building momentum, like priming a pump to get the water flowing.
I can see how that would be helpful. Sometimes a task just feels so huge that you freeze up and don't even know where to start.
Exactly. The do something principle is about just starting, taking that first tiny step, and trusting that you'll gain momentum as you go.
This is making me think about my own productivity struggles and even those times when I get creatively blocked. But before we move on, I want to touch on this idea of being wrong. In one of the excerpts, Manson talks about how much we suffer because we hold on to beliefs that are just, well, not true.
That's a key point. He's saying that our beliefs are often based on limited information or assumptions that are just plain wrong. He mentions this psychological experiment where people created these elaborate theories to explain a system that was completely random.
Wait, what was this experiment?
So they put people in a room with these buttons. The participants thought that if they pressed the buttons in a certain way, a light would flash and they'd earn a point. But the points were totally random. There was no pattern to figure out.
That's wild. So our brains try to find order and meaning even when things are random?
We're wired to look for patterns to make sense of the world, even when there is no sense to be made.
It makes you wonder how many of our strongly held beliefs are based on stuff like that. Misinterpretations.
That's the scary part. But Manson says that recognizing our tendency to be wrong is actually freeing. It helps us question things and be open to new perspectives.
So it's about being skeptical of the world and ourselves.
Exactly. It's realizing we don't have all the answers and being open to changing our minds when we learn something new.
And that connects back to his law avoidance, right? The more a belief is tied to who we think we are, the harder it is to question it.
Right. We build walls around our beliefs to protect our egos, but those walls can become prisons, stopping us from growing and evolving.
So this all comes back to choosing your values carefully because, well, if your beliefs are flawed, the values you build on them will be shaky too, right?
Exactly. Manson's encouraging us to go on a journey of self-discovery, constantly asking questions, challenging what we think is true, and refining our values. That's how we live a more authentic, fulfilling life.
Wow, this is a lot to unpack. It seems like he's really encouraging us to question everything, but we haven't even touched on one big theme, mortality. How does he approach such a, well, taboo subject?
He approaches it honestly with a lot of vulnerability and even some dark humor. He tells this really personal story about his friend Josh, who died in a cliff diving accident when they were young.
I'm definitely curious to hear more about that story and how it changed his perspective.
Well, in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how Josh's death affected Manson's worldview and how it led him to embrace the, as he calls it, bitter antidote of acknowledging death.
Wow, I can't wait to hear more. It sounds like he's saying that accepting our own mortality can actually make us feel more free and help us see things more clearly.
You got it. It's about realizing that our time is limited and using that awareness to make choices that matter and give our lives meaning.
Okay, this is definitely a conversation that needs to continue, but for now, we'll have to leave our listeners with a little bit of a cliffhanger.
I think they'll be eager to come back and hear what other insights Manson has in store for us in the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a fuck. Before the break, we were talking about, well, death, and how Manson thinks that accepting it can make for a more fulfilling life. You mentioned a story about his friend Josh.
Yeah, that's kind of the turning point of the book. Manson talks about how his friend Josh died in a cliff diving accident when they were just teenagers. It really made him face the fact that life is fragile, and think about what was really important.
That's a heavy thing to go through, especially so young. Did he say anything about what happened that night?
Yeah, he describes being distracted by a girl at this party, not really realizing Josh was serious about jumping. They even talked about, seeking the truth, which takes on this whole other meaning after the accident.
That's eerie. It sounds like it completely changed how he saw things after that.
Absolutely. Manson says it was the biggest before and after moment in his life. Before Josh's death, he says he was a pretty typical stoner kid, middle class. But afterwards, something changed. He got more serious, more driven, and more focused on living a life with purpose.
It's like Josh's death woke him up to how precious and short life is. And this is where Ernest Becker's work comes in, right?
Exactly. He connects what happened to him with Becker's ideas about death terror. The concept that our fear of dying motivates a lot of what we do.
So like we're all subconsciously trying to avoid death.
Kind of, yeah. Becker says we create these immortality projects, ways to try to live on even after we're gone, through achievements, beliefs, or our legacy.
It makes sense. We want to leave a mark on the world through our work, relationships, things like that. It's a way to ensure that a part of us continues even after we're not physically here. But are all of these immortality projects bad?
Not necessarily, no. But they could be a problem when they're based on the wrong values, or when we cling to them too tightly.
It's like building a monument to yourself, but using materials that'll crumble over time.
Exactly. Manson says we have to face our mortality, accept that we're going to die. He calls it the bitter antidote.
Okay, but how do you get comfortable with that? Death is pretty terrifying.
Well, Manson talks about his own way of dealing with it. He literally sat on the edge of a cliff, just feeling that existential terror.
Whoa, that's intense. He was basically facing his biggest fear head on.
He was. And he describes it as scary, but also liberating. He said it was like that cliff and the fear were the only things that could shake him out of his own BS and show him what was truly important.
So by staring death in the face, he got a clearer view of what mattered, like a near-death experience that made him super aware.
Yeah, exactly. It stripped away all the distractions and forced him to focus on what was essential.
It makes you think about how much we distract ourselves from death, being busy, chasing stuff, constantly on social media. Are we all just running from the inevitable?
Manson talks about that too. He calls it entitlement, this idea that we deserve a life without pain, struggle, or disappointment. And he says that this feeling of entitlement actually makes us more isolated and prevents real connection with others.
So we build walls to protect ourselves from pain, but those walls also block out love, empathy, real human connection.
Right. He says the way to overcome that entitlement is to embrace the fact that we're all in this together, facing the same end. That's what can create real connection and compassion.
That's a good way to look at it. It's not about ignoring death, but seeing it as a shared human experience.
Exactly. It's about finding meaning and purpose because of our mortality, not in spite of it.
This has given me a lot to think about. It's like he's suggesting a total shift in perspective, embracing everything, good and bad.
He is. And it's not about becoming obsessed with death. It's about using that awareness to live a more authentic life, a life that means something, a life that's connected to others.
It ties back to that idea of choosing your struggles too. If we know our time is limited, why not choose struggles that are aligned with what we believe in, struggles that contribute to something bigger than ourselves?
You got it. It's about realizing that life is a gift, even with all the rough parts.
This is a lot to absorb, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling it too. Is there anything else you want to highlight before we get to the final part of our deep dive?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that Manson's not saying we should become cold or unfeeling. It's not about suppressing emotions or detach it from the world.
Right. It's not about becoming some kind of robot. It's about being more careful about what we give our energy and attention to.
Exactly. It's about being deliberate about what we care about and letting go of the things that don't matter. It's about being real about life, the messy parts and the beautiful parts. And it's about having the guts to live a life that's true to ourselves, even though we know it's going to end someday.
Well said. It's a good reminder that life is a gift, and we have the power to choose how we experience it.
Exactly. It's about taking control of our own lives, accepting our flaws, and making choices that reflect our values.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and helping us unpack all these ideas. And to our listeners, we want to hear from you. What parts of this deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a fuck resonated with you? What are you choosing to give a fuck about? You can leave us a comment on our website or connect with us on social media. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. We've talked about everything from embracing our imperfections to facing our own mortality. What else does Manson have in store for us?
You know, all these ideas have this common thread, this idea of questioning our assumptions, like really facing our insecurities and accepting that we might be wrong.
So it's not just about what we choose to care about, it's also about questioning the beliefs behind our values.
Exactly. And honestly, that could be pretty uncomfortable. Manson says the more a belief is tied to who we think we are, the harder it is to question it. He calls it the law of avoidance.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like we build these walls around our beliefs to protect our egos, even if those beliefs aren't really serving us well.
Right. They can become prisons, stopping us from growing.
So how do you escape those prisons? How do we get better at questioning those deep-seated beliefs?
Manson says we need to get comfortable with uncertainty. Instead of clinging to the idea of being certain, we should look for doubt. Doubt about our beliefs, our feelings, even about the future.
That's kind of a radical idea. We're always told to be confident, to have the answers. But you're saying that embracing uncertainty is actually good for us.
It is. Certainty can be a trap. It can stop us from being open to new information, new experiences, and ultimately, new possibilities.
It's about being okay with not knowing everything, being open to different ideas, different ways of seeing things.
You got it. And that brings us back to one of the most powerful messages in the book, taking action even when things are uncertain. Remember the do something principle.
We talked about it earlier. I'd love to hear more. Like, how does it work practically?
It starts with the idea that you don't need motivation to take action. We usually wait until we feel inspired to do something, but Manson says we should just act first. He says if you don't feel motivated to change something important, just do something, anything, and then use that to motivate yourself.
So it's about taking that first step, no matter how small, and letting the momentum build.
Exactly. It's like a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, right?
Yeah, I really connect with that. I often overthink and plan too much, and then I end up procrastinating. But just starting, even if it's tiny, can be so powerful.
That's the beauty of it. It's simple, easy to do, and really effective.
We've covered a lot today, from accepting our flaws to facing death, even questioning our beliefs. This deep dive has really been thought-provoking. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
You know, the main takeaway from The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck is that it's not about being apathetic or uncaring. It's about choosing what truly matters to you and putting your energy into those things. It's about accepting all of life, the good and the bad, and having the courage to live authentically, even though we're all going to die someday.
Well said. It reminds us that life is a gift, and we have the power to choose how we want to experience it.
Exactly. It's about taking control, owning our imperfections, and making choices based on our values.
Thanks so much for sharing your insights and helping us unpack these ideas. And to our listeners, we'd love to hear from you. What stood out to you from our deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a fuck? What are you choosing to give a fuck about? Leave a comment on our website or connect with us on social media. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.